Warning, the following podcast is intended for mature audiences only. Listener discretion is advised. If you are sensitive to any content or subject matter in films, I recommend looking up this film on doesthedogdie.com. It is a user-based database of extensive content warnings for pretty much every film you can think of. It basically gives you a heads up to all the potentially triggering topics a movie might have. Check it out and take care of yourself. Welcome back to We Creeps. I'm your host, Evan Exhumed. And just like before, every week I summarize and review a different horror film for people who are a little too squeamish or easily spooked to watch them, but still really enjoy the plot and often end up looking them up on Wikipedia or Googling the ending explained. We, of course, welcome horror movie fans all the same. Unless you're the kind that gatekeeps, then you can just go away and continue to sit in your throne of isolation. This week I will be covering another A24 film, Bodies, Bodies, Bodies. Directed by Helena Rain, written by Kristen Rupenian and Sarah DeLapp. This movie stars Amanda Stanberg, Maria Bakalova, Rachel Sano, Chase Sue Wonders, Mahaila Harold, Pete Davidson, and Lee Pace. I feel like this film took me a while to get to, but after seeing it a few times, I felt like it might be fun to do for this podcast. I think it has a lot of really funny commentary on sort of the bastardization of some psychology terms and counseling terms such as gaslighting and toxic and things like that. And it's really interesting to see this sort of cultural critique of wealthier millennials, Gen Z sort of thing. And I don't know, I really enjoy the dialogue in this, and it's not particularly scary. So if you think you can stomach it, I definitely recommend it. There's not a lot of gore in it as well, and there is a fair amount of just really funny dialogue. So with that said, let's go ahead and get started on Bodies, Bodies, Bodies. We start the film with some making out between two of the main characters. We have Sophie and we have B. Sophie and B are in a relationship. They're around college age. Seems like it's a relatively newer relationship. Sophie says, "I love you" for the first time while they're making out. B just kind of silently stares. So, might not be on the same page here. We then learn that Sophie is taking B to a house party by her childhood friend, David. It seems that this is going to be the first time that B has really met any of Sophie's friends, so B is a little bit nervous. B also seems to have an accent that is Eastern European descent of some sort. So B and Sophie finally arrive at the giant mansion, which apparently all of Sophie's friends, including Sophie, are pretty rich. This is also where we meet the entire cast of the movie, who thankfully most of them are going to die, so I don't have to keep up with names for too long. First, we have Alice and her boyfriend, who is kind of in his maybe mid-40s, named Greg. Then we have Emma and David, who appear to be dating. Jordan is the last friend, who seems to be single. Sophie introduces B to all of her friends, and it seems that Jordan has some animosity towards Sophie. We also learn a little bit about the other characters. Alice has a podcast, for example. David is the owner of the house. Well, his father is the owner of the house. And he also seems to be harboring some animosity, specifically towards Greg, Alice's older boyfriend. So in celebration for Sophie returning, because I guess it had been a while and it seems like Sophie had been kind of a flake, we also learned that Sophie had recently gotten sober, which might be part of it. But in celebration for her coming here, Alice and Greg break out the champagne. And this is an important note here, but Greg uses a sword that he found on David's wall to break open the bottle, like slice off the top. And this pisses off David. And he's like, "Don't touch my dad's shit, blah, 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 blah." And then a downpour of rain begins. And we learn that this is a hurricane party, which I guess is something you do in whatever area they're in. The idea is that you all come together, hang out in the house during the hurricane, get drunk, have a little bit of fun. The idea is to do it together rather than have to face it alone, which is kind of sweet and probably something that I would do. Everybody heads inside to dry off, and B and Sophie start unpacking. David suddenly appears and tells Sophie that he wants to talk to her alone, And so B goes off and then is approached by Jordan, the one who is single and separate from everybody, and says, hey, watch out about Sophie, okay? Which is definitely not the best thing to hear about your girlfriend the first time that you meet their friends. Meanwhile, David and Sophie have a little bit of a conversation. We learn that David's friend, Max, left abruptly after getting into a fight with him and gave him a black eye. We also learn that David is like kind of weirdly jealous of Alice and Greg, but there's not really a clear reason. Maybe they dated in the past. I'm not sure if that's implied, but based on his jealousy, it feels kind of like that. But overall, David feels a little weird about Sophie just randomly bringing her girlfriend without having let anyone know. So then we get a nice little montage of everybody partying. B accidentally eats too much of the edibles, so she gets kind of funky. Everyone is just seeming to have a really good time and drinking and just having a ball. Sophie then exclaims that she wants to play Bodies, 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 which is a game where one person is the killer and all of the lights go out. Everybody kind of hides. The killer looks for people and then taps them on the back. The player who is tapped pretends to die. They cannot speak. They can't give hints or anything. And then once the body is found, the person who found it has to scream bodies, bodies, bodies. And then from there, everyone has to try to figure out who the killer is. So it's basically Among Us. It's human Among Us. So after doing a little bit of coke and slapping the shit out of each other for some reason, they all go to hide. And after a few moments, we hear bodies, bodies, bodies. And we can see that Greg, the handsome older 40-year-old gentleman, has been, quote, murdered, unquote. He's not actually dead. He's just playing the game. So the entire group tries to figure out who killed Greg. And during this, David starts to be pretty shitty towards Greg, just being really condescending and asking him sort of misleading questions to kind of make him look stupid. So Greg decides to be the bigger man and put himself to bed and just step away from that situation. Afterwards, they continue to try to figure out who might have been the killer. And David and his girlfriend, Emma, start to get into sort of a fight. There's some discussions of sex drive and just all these other weird sort of things that aren't super important. So David eventually gets angry and storms off, and then the rest of the girls hang out, do a little more drinking, do a little more coke, do a little more slapping for some reason. And then suddenly the power goes out, and so the rest of them try to figure out if that is David or something, just because the storm is worsening, so it's likely related, but it could have been David because he's pouting. So the whole gang starts to look for David and for the breaker box, and while downstairs, B sees David suddenly come towards the glass door and slams into it. He's bleeding profusely, and then everyone storms him to see what's going on with him, and it appears that his neck has been slashed. So David is the first to die tonight, and actually die. Not this game anymore. We got some real deaths going on now. So everyone is panicking. Their cell phones aren't going through to call 911. So they run to their car to see if they can just drive out of there and get help. But unfortunately, Alice left her car lights on. Your dad, when you were growing up doing those road trips, always told you to turn them off, and this is probably why. So without really a way to get out of there, they just head back to the house and try to figure things out. They all start to think that perhaps it's Greg, considering Alice has only dated him for a couple weeks. They go to check their room and find that Greg has like a go bag, which includes like a knife, a map of the area, a headlamp, and just, sort of doomsday type preparation stuff, which can also be really mixed up with killer stuff. So they go to confront Greg and see what the fuck he's doing with that goddamn bag. So he's just chilling out in the mansion gym, putting his little light therapy face mask on, which seems really legit. It's like a mask that emits like white light if you have seasonal depression or something. I need to get one of those, honestly. Anyway, sorry. They all confront Greg about the go bag, and he's just like, well, it's a hurricane. We might need it for an emergency. And everyone is just really suspicious of him, pointing knives at him. He initially thinks that they're fucking with him, but he soon realizes that they're not. And a struggle begins to ensue. People dropping knives, tackling each other. And B comes out of nowhere with a kettlebell and smashes it over Greg's head. She does it a few more times to make sure he's dead, and we now have our second death. And now you have one less character to have to keep track of. The remaining group begin to panic because they just killed someone, and for a quick second, we see that Sophie, who was sober, goes back to one of the rooms that they were doing coke, and she snorts a line, unfortunately relapsing. Meanwhile, B goes to clean herself up. The rest of the people are now all together, sort of talking about the situation. Sophie randomly starts opening up board games and opens up a piece and finds a drug. Maybe it's like a Xanax or something. And she ends up handing it to Emma. Emma randomly kisses Sophie, and I don't really understand why. Sophie seems kind of off-put by it, and Emma just was like, well, isn't this what you wanted? So I don't know if there was just like they hooked up in the past or something, but a few moments later, Alice is wandering the house and she stumbles across Emma's dead body at the bottom of the staircase. So now we just have Alice, Sophie, B, and Jordan remain. Alice begins to panic, thinking that whoever's doing this is trying to copy the bodies game. But overall, it seems like the rest of them aren't really believing her. However, they all start to get suspicious of Sophie's girlfriend, B. One of the reasons is that Jordan apparently Googled and sees that she's not actually in the same college as Sophie, so that there was some sort of lie. This causes everyone to freak out at B, and so they kick her out into the hurricane, and she quickly runs to the car that's not currently working, but just to find shelter. And while she's doing this, she notices that in one of the bags that is Sophie's, there is matching underwear to underwear that she found earlier that was owned by Jordan. So this sort of implies that Sophie has cheated on her with Jordan. B goes back to the house to try to find a way back inside since the car is not working out so good for her. And she notices that Jordan is looking around, rifling through something, and then pulls a gun out of a drawer. So B is like, holy shit, Jordan is probably the killer. So she ends up finding a way in and grabs some tools from the garage to confront everyone. So B confronts everyone and points out that Jordan is most likely the killer and that she has a gun. Jordan empties her pockets and there doesn't seem to be a gun, but there is the bodies, little sticky note with an X on it, which I forgot to mention earlier, but that is how you know who the killer is. Jordan then puts the blame back on B, saying that she never even went to Utah State, so that was a lie, so why should they trust her? And then B reveals that she actually had to drop out of school to help take care of her mother, who has borderline personality disorder. And Jordan, gets a little ableist here and says that that's probably one of the reasons why B is the killer is because there's a history of mental illness in her family. And so they kind of argue about that stuff for a little bit before moving on. Then, of course, everybody kind of starts playing the blame game. We learned that there was a little bit of tension between Sophie and Jordan due to Sophie's drug addiction. We learned that she was forcibly put into rehab, and one of the reasons that she stopped hanging out with everybody was because it caused her to fall back into bad habits. We then also learn that Jordan and Sophie apparently hooked up very close to before everybody coming to this party. Sophie, of course, denies this, but I think we all kind of know that it's true. Sophie then starts talking some good shit back to Jordan, saying that I would never date you. You're a cold, heartless person. Also, you're a piece of shit to your friend Alice, and you don't even like her podcast, which, if you're my friend and you don't like my podcast, just keep that shit to yourself, okay? Just keep telling me the lie, because I don't think I could handle that. And Alice certainly does not handle that well. And so upon learning that Jordan does not actually listen to her podcast and that she only listens to it, she starts to just rag on Jordan as well. This causes Jordan to get a little emotional, so she shoots Alice in the leg, which, Alice is pretty upset about. Everyone then goes for Jordan to try to get the gun away from her. Unfortunately, when 4 people are all trying to struggle for a gun, someone's probably going to get shot, and the gun does go off and kills Alice by hitting her in the heart. Jordan stands back up with the gun, claiming that she's not the killer, that this was a mistake. And both Sophie and B try to approach her to take the gun back. They end up heading upstairs during this conflict, and the 3 of them all struggle and try to get the gun from Jordan. And while on the staircase, B pushes Jordan off of the staircase and she falls down a couple stories, landing on a glass table, which causes her to eventually bleed out. And she fires the gun over and over into the ceiling. And the last words she said are to check her texts. She says this specifically to B to imply that Sophie was in fact cheating on her. So B and Sophie hide out a little bit together where B confronts Sophie asking if it's true, did she actually get cheated on? And Sophie still lies and says that she has not. And because of this, B is just like, I don't trust you. And she starts to run away and hide from Sophie. They both claim that they did not kill anyone. And this causes a little bit of a desperate cat and mouse situation. The morning finally comes, the hurricane is over, and B is outside looking at David's dead body. Suddenly, Sophie comes up behind her and hugs her, saying, I was looking for you everywhere. And she admits to having done some coke and relapsing, giving Emma some pills, which caused her to trip and fall down the stairs, dying. And she was just scared to admit it to anyone because she didn't think that anyone would believe her, especially given the circumstances. And as they're hugging, B pulls out the gun from earlier and is like, bitch, let me see that phone. So as Sophie is about to give her the phone, she tosses it and B just does a beeline for it. And they begin to struggle, actually struggling over the phone more than the gun that B was holding. And they fall into the pool, struggle a little bit more. B gets out first and picks up a phone and notices that it's not Sophie's phone, it's actually David's phone. So she picks it up and goes to David's body and uses the Face ID to open it and see what was on it. Here is the big reveal as to who was the killer in Bodies, Bodies, Bodies. We see a TikTok video of David with the sword trying to open up a champagne bottle like Greg did successfully earlier. And he continues to struggle with it, trying to pop it open with the sword. And he ends up doing it blade towards his neck. And when the champagne pops, it causes the blade to come flying towards him, slashing his neck, causing him to bleed out and die. So this reveal implies that no one actually intentionally murdered anyone. Greg died because he was a dumbass and pointed the blade towards himself, so he killed himself. Greg was killed because they thought he was the killer by B. Alice was accidentally shot. Emma got too fucked up and fell down the stairs. Jordan was killed because she had a gun and everybody thought she was the killer. So now there's only Sophie and B left. And they're just like, holy shit. And as the movie's ending, Greg's friend Max shows up in the backyard and just looks at them and looks at David's body and is like, what the hell happened? And the movie just fucking ends. That's it. So I definitely recommend watching this one because, you know, the plot twist is really interesting and it is kind of funny to go into it knowing that nobody's actually the killer and these people are all just really vapid and narcissistic. And the dialogue is something that I can't really perfectly translate to this podcast because there's just so much of it that's just really funny, but not super relevant to the plot. So like I said, I definitely recommend watching this one. There's really no gore in it, maybe just a teeny bit, but nothing that should really upset the average person. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of Week Creeps. Do be sure to check out the link tree in the description, or you can go to weekcreeps.com. From there, you can find my Tumblr, my Instagram, my Twitter. You can also support the podcast by following us and subscribing to us on Patreon. You do get episodes a little bit early. And you can also buy merch from tpublic.com. They're super size inclusive, their customer service is great, and you can get a mug or a t-shirt or a banner, anything you want really, even a little sticker. And if you can, just word of mouth is really great. Recommend it to, you know, your girlfriend or friend who is really freaked out by horror movies, or maybe you have a friend who's obsessed with them and wants to hear my funny commentary. Either way, just letting people know that We Creeps exists is a great way to support the podcast. So with that said, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week. A happy 4th of July to those who celebrate it. And if you are setting off fireworks, be sure to be safe and also be sure to stay spooky out there.